1. Something happened early this morning that has left me still shaking uncontrollably. My 2 female cousins live with us in our basement. Since they're students, it's important to the story. So I went to bed at around 1:30 to 2 in the morning, and was sleeping in my room. All of a sudden I woke up around 3:30 with my younger brother screaming for my parents. I at first thought he had a nightmare, or, I don't know, maybe saw a bug. So I was like, what the heck, and I closed my eyes again. My younger brother sleeps in my parents' room because he finds the bed more comfy, and they just sleep in his room. Not even 2 seconds later I hear a loud banging noise on the patio door connected to my parents' bedroom, and hear my brother scream again. I lay still because I thought I was imagining things. Then maybe 5 or 6 seconds later I hear my mom go, "Go, I'm calling the police, leave!" And I just sit up, I put on my pants and go, and what I saw just made my heart beat so fast. There was a man standing outside the patio door. He was shirtless and only had black joggers on. He was also wearing a cross necklace. He was just banging on the door and said, "Can I have a cigarette?" WTF, we don't smoke, so we said no. And then he continued trying to open the patio door, but one of my female cousins was holding it tightly closed. We thought he was either a drug user or a drunk guy, but still he would just not leave. Then after 3 minutes, felt like 3 hours, Jesus, and of just standing there trying to open the patio door, he descended down the stairs. But then he went to the side of our house, and my dad sprinted to the front door, and Cassie was standing outside trying to get in, our new friend. My dad is a pretty buff, intimidating-looking guy to people who don't know him. So my dad was like, should I just go out and tell him to leave? But of course we were all like, no, WTF, because what if he has a weapon on him? So again he tries to open the door, but my other cousin, she was holding the doorknob super tight. By the way, my mom was on the phone with the 911 operator the whole time, but she wasn't making it seem as scary as it should have been, in my opinion. She was just saying he's drunk and he's knocking on our door, while this guy was literally trying to get in our house. So I just grabbed the phone and told the operator, "Hi, I really think you should come right now, because he's trying to enter our home. You need to come right now, please." And the lady got the message, or whatever. Then the scariest part for me. When I went back to the room with the patio door, I didn't realize he was there, because I was just pacing around scared out of my mind. So when I moved the blinds a bit to see if he had come back, which I thought he hadn't, I almost fainted because he was right there in front of the glass. I screamed super loud and everyone came running, and I thought I was gonna die. My heart was beating so fast it was insane. This motherfucker stood at our door trying to get in for so long, and then went to the front door and tried it again, and then finally he left our house area and went further up. So then my cousin decided to open the door to see if he went away fully, but then saw him walking back in our house's direction. She quickly shut the door again. He went to the side of our house and just stood there. But then the police came, and he was just gone. So the police brought their dog and stuff, and like 20 minutes later they came back, said they found him and arrested him. Turns out he was just shit-faced drunk. The scary things, though, to me are the fact that, one, if he was so drunk, how did he manage to just keep going back and forth between our 2 doors? And even when he went away from our home a bit further up, he still came back to our place specifically. 2, the way I described him doesn't do it justice, if that's the right word. The closest guess I could describe him as is that he looked like Eren when he turned into a Titan in Attack on Titan. So scary drunk guy who was trying to enter my house, asking for a cigarette, let's not meet again. 2. It was the spring of 1997 and I was 9 years old. My family lived in a lower middle-class beach community on the shores of southern Connecticut. Our house sat at the end of an L-shaped street that branched off a main road, terminating at a small rocky beach on the Sound. In our backyard sat a massive dying tree, with branches that stretched out over the top of our 2-story peach-sided home. In the spring and summer, hundreds of green monk parrots would perch on its branches. Behind my backyard, parallel to the street, sat a swamp we called the reed forest. As kids, we would tamp down a circuit of pathways in the dense reeds. It was a great way to travel during our many clandestine operations. All the kids in our street were approximately the same age, and everybody knew everybody. Our parents' get-togethers always became community get-togethers. in a very tight-knit street of families, all at the same relative place in life. I was trusted from an early age to take care of myself and my younger sister in the gap between when school let out and when our parents returned from work. We would take the bus home each day around 3 p.m., and I would frantically attempt to finish my homework against the bus window. It was Thursday, and the bus stopped at the usual location, between the bend of the road and the beach. The bus doors opened and we poured out. My sister ran to her friend's house while I made my way home. I reached to open the clasp of my front gate when I noticed 2 men approaching from across the street. "How's it going, young man?" I looked at them, and then back at the gate, and then back at them. "We just opened a cleaning business and we have a promotion. Are your parents home?" "They will be home in a couple of minutes. Do you mind if we wait here until they arrive?" "Okay." I casually opened the gate, shut the metal clasp, and walked up to our front porch. Our porch was screened off, and the screen was surrounded by horizontal glass shutter windows, the kind that are ubiquitous in New England coastal homes. I walked up the 2 cement steps and reached the door. I knew the door was locked, and I knew I had a key, but I turned the knob anyway. Locked. "Those windows look dirty. How about we get to work on them before your parents get home?" I could feel their eyes. I turned around, ignoring their question, and mumbled, "Must be locked. Need to go around the back." Without making eye contact with the men, I walked down off the steps and turned the corner at the side of the house, out of their line of sight for a moment. I sprinted lengthwise down the gutter of the house. In a single motion, I lobbed my backpack over the interior wooden fence and climbed after it into the backyard. I briskly walked up our back deck and went for the sliding door. Just then, my father slid the glass door open and greeted me. "Hey, bud, I took the day off. How was your day?" At that moment, all the feelings of unease and fear evaporated. I felt a bit guilty for my reaction when the men approached me. I walked past my dad and dropped my book bag in the hallway and proceeded to the kitchen. I opened the fridge. "Some guys are out front trying to sell us something, and they want to know if they could talk to you." My dad entered the kitchen looking exasperated. "I'm not buying anything." He picked up our family dog in one arm and proceeded to the front of the house. I quickly shut the fridge and followed close behind. He walked onto the porch and shut the door behind him. I peered through our front window and noticed the gate was open and the 2 men were now in our front yard, just before the steps to our porch. My dad was talking with them. I couldn't tell what they were saying, but after about a minute, the men nodded and left. When my dad returned, I asked him what they wanted. He said not to worry about it. We both watched them from the porch until they were out of sight. My dad dragged his finger across one of the glass panes. "We need to clean these windows." That weekend, I was playing kickball with some friends down the street. When the game wrapped up, I hopped on my bike and made my way home for dinner. When I approached the house, I saw 2 police officers speaking to my mom and dad on the front lawn. My dad gave me the signal to go inside. News breaks. Several homes in the Point Beach neighborhood were burglarized. In each case, the occupants had been rushed at their doors and tied up with rope and duct tape. Nobody was seriously injured. The assailants reportedly went door to door, posing as a cleaning company to gain entry to homes. We'll be right back after these messages. 3. For reference, I'm a 27-year-old female, and this story takes place 10 years ago, when I was 17. I just started university and was excited about having a fresh new start, since I'd always been a nerdy outcast in high school. I had never had a boyfriend before. I had never even been on a date, so I was naive and optimistic about boys. My introverted and awkward personality hadn't magically changed since entering university, so it's safe to say that I didn't meet any interesting guys at school. One late night, I was in my room working on an assignment on my laptop when I received a request on MSN Messenger. The email address was a boy's name with some numbers. The name was clearly ethnic and likely someone of the same origin as me. Intrigued, I accepted. For the sake of the story, we'll call this boy Ken. We got to chatting, and I asked him how he'd gotten my email address. He dodged the question. I let it go, not thinking too much of it. This was from a time when it was normal to accept anyone and everyone as a friend on Facebook and other social media platforms. As Ken and I continued to talk, I learned that he lived in my city and apparently wasn't much older than me. As I'd guessed, our roots were in fact in the same country, India. I asked him why he didn't have a picture of himself on his display picture, and this prompted him to suggest that we turn on our webcams because he wanted to see me too. I declined, but he insisted. Somehow he convinced me and we both switched on our webcams. I was pleasantly surprised and somewhat relieved to see that Ken was a good-looking young guy, chatting to me from the comfort of his bedroom, seemingly very normal. Our MSN chats carried on for a couple of weeks. They developed into texts, and we even had a few phone calls, and after I had agreed to give him my phone number, I started to develop a crush on Ken. He asked me to go out with him a couple of times, but I was always pretty busy with school and our schedules weren't lining up. Finally, we found one afternoon when we were both free, and decided to schedule a lunch date. Ken had a car and offered to pick me up from my university after I was done for the day. I was a little too dressed up for my C+ programming classes, but just right for the lunch date we had planned at a local vegetarian restaurant. Stupidly, I didn't tell any of my friends where I was going or with whom, because I was embarrassed about going on my very first date at almost age 18, with someone who randomly added me on MSN. I waited outside my building when a black car with heavily tinted windows showed up beside me. The passenger side window rolled down, and sure enough, there was Ken, sitting in the driver's seat. I was happy to see that he was as cute in person as he was on webcam. However, I wasn't expecting the intense smell of weed floating out of the car. Not relevant, but part of the first impression. Admittedly, I was a bit taken aback and was concerned that he might be driving high. He unlocked the doors and motioned for me to get in, so I did, without dispute. As I sat down in the passenger seat, he immediately put his hand on my thigh. I nervously shifted my leg away. "So, do you know where the restaurant is? I can guide you if you want." He smirked at me, but didn't say anything, and just started driving. Okay, kinda weird. I thought maybe he was just nervous or awkward, both of which I could sympathize with, so I let it be. I was about to try my hand at a little small talk, which I'm no good at, when I noticed him heading towards the highway ramp. I started to worry because the restaurant was not far from my campus, and there was no reason for us to be getting on the highway. You don't need to take the highway. The restaurant is really close by, I can guide you." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear my own nervousness. Ken finally spoke for the first time since I'd gotten in the car. "I thought maybe we could just go to my place instead. We can play Need for Speed, and I can make lunch for you." I was 17, on my way to the house of a guy I just met for the first time, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. My mind was racing. I knew that this would be an utterly stupid thing to do. Despite the clear red flags waving in my face, I decided that I didn't want to ruin our first date by rejecting his offer to make me lunch and play NFS together, which I told him I'd liked playing. Don't judge me. So like an idiot, I reluctantly agreed to avoid being rude. We made it to his house. It was apparently his family's home and was situated in a sort of shady neighborhood. We stepped inside and, of course, no one was home except us. It was sparsely furnished and looked unkempt, which struck me as pretty odd for a family home. He informed me that his Xbox was in his bedroom. I hesitated in the doorway, but he sat at the foot of his bed in front of the TV and patted an empty space beside him for me to have a seat. There was literally nowhere else to sit in this room, so I cautiously sat down, keeping as much distance as I could between us. I started to relax as we played NFS, and he made us PB&Js to munch on. I was about to laugh at myself for being overly paranoid when Ken did something bizarre. He got up onto the bed and sat down directly behind me. His legs were either side of me, an extremely awkward position, and tried to guide my hands on the controller. I started to ask him what he was doing, and as if this wasn't uncomfortable enough, his hands moved from the controller and slid under my shirt. That's when I really started to panic. I thought he was going to try to grip my chest, but instead he started squeezing and massaging my belly. I was more than a little chubby back then, freshman 15 and some. so you can imagine what that might have been like. I dropped the controller in pure shock and quickly stood up, fixing my shirt. I was at a loss for words, and he did nothing but smirk and tell me he liked it. I felt completely disgusted and violated. I'd had enough. I lied and told him that I had a group project to work on and needed to go. He asked me where I lived, so he could drop me home. Thankfully, I had the common sense not to tell him, and I asked him to drop me back to school instead, where I would supposedly be meeting my classmates. He obliged. After our very uncomfortable first date, I decided I didn't want to talk to Ken anymore. I didn't block him on MSN or my phone, our only two methods of communication, but I rarely responded to his messages and I ignored all of his calls. Once he messaged me on MSN around 11 p.m., asking me to come over and telling me that he would send a cab to bring me over to his place. Thoroughly annoyed, I responded, "What do you take me for? Why do you even think I would want to do that?" He replied saying, "No sex, I promise." Just bizarre. I was disgusted and didn't even respond. He continued trying to get in touch with me for months and then suddenly vanished. I figured he'd finally gotten the point. Now, I wish this story ended here, but it doesn't. I last heard from Ken in late February. He had stopped trying to contact me shortly after Valentine's Day. In April, 2 nuclear family members and I went on holiday to visit another relative, who we'll call Anne, who was living in the Caribbean at the time. Anne, whom I loved dearly, was and still is a bit of an eccentric. She considers herself very spiritual and is an active member of a large, well-known spiritual organization. She is deeply connected with India, more than the rest of us are, and goes back for frequent visits. While we stayed with her in the Caribbean, she told us about her most recent spiritual trip to India, where she met a wealthy and well-connected local woman through the organization, who quickly became a very close friend, Connie. During our visit, Anne introduced us to Connie virtually over Skype, because Connie lives in India. We chatted with her a couple of times throughout our vacation via Skype, and got to know her a little bit. Little did we know back then that Connie, who Anne had spontaneously met halfway across the world in India, would soon wreak utter havoc on our lives. Now, that's a story that I'm just not and may never be ready to tell because of how many lives were affected and the severity of the damage that had been inflicted. What you need to know is that Connie was an outright criminal and con artist who had been targeting our family from long before Anne had actually met her. Their meeting was no coincidence. Not only did she manage to steal over $100,000 from our family, but she took any peace of mind or sense of security we had ever had. When we finally caught on and confronted her, she insisted that we were mistaken, but disappeared into thin air once we forced her out of our lives. You're probably wondering what on earth this has to do with my story about Ken. Well, get this. The situation with Connie lasted many months. The whole thing is kind of a blur to me now, but we first spoke to her online in April, and I remember the whole ordeal lasting well into the fall. While she normally resided in India, Anne had invited her to visit and stay with us where we, my whole family and I, presently live. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Some of the things I clearly remember and are important to this story were that 1, the whole time she was staying with us, she was trying to convince me to transfer schools to a very obscure school program in the US. I don't even live in the US, and was actually getting very pushy about it. And 2, she had asked me if I was a virgin and told me to save myself from my husband. Disturbing, I know. During this time, I was so emotionally drained and stressed that I didn't really think of anything but the situation at hand. In fact, I had stopped socializing almost entirely and even started habitually skipping classes. I had lost contact with my high school friends, and my university friends were too new to really care, so my strange behavior and new destructive habits went unnoticed. Fast forward to one day after Connie's final disappearance in the fall. I was at home with my dad when my cell phone rang. I looked at the caller ID, and it was a number I didn't have saved, so it was showing the contact information as whatever name the phone was registered under. My heart dropped into my stomach. My phone displayed a name. The first name was a man's name, and the last name was the same last name as Connie's. I started to panic and ran into my bedroom to answer the call. I had no idea what to expect. When I picked up the phone, I was greeted by a familiar voice. It was Ken. I honestly thought I was going to puke when I came to a sudden realization that he had been part of this whole sick plot. Of course, I don't have hard evidence to prove he was connected to Connie, but let me explain. The timing of his appearance and reappearance into my life. The last name, a fairly unique surname, originating from the part of India where Connie is from, and I had never known Ken's last name until then. And the fact that he contacted me out of the blue and I had no idea why or how were all just too bizarre to be a mere coincidence. Of course, I freaked out at Ken when he called and told him that if he ever called me again, I would call the police. His response was just a weird, dry half laugh, and then he said, "Well, okay then." I knew in my gut that this was their last attempt to get back in touch and somehow slither their way back into mine and my family's lives. Thankfully, I never heard from Ken again after that day. A while after this all ended, I was having a conversation with a family member who was also closely involved in all this about the whole ordeal, and she told me she sensed something extremely wrong when Connie was pushing to have me sent off to the US. To that obscure school. She had an unshakable feeling that Connie was involved in some sort of human trafficking scene, and that if I left, she would never see me again. The horrifying pieces came together for me at that time. I was just too damn naive to have seen it before. The memories flooded back to me when I heard that. How Ken had told me no sex, I promise, when he invited me over, and how Connie was telling me to remain a virgin. As I said, I had never told a soul about Ken, nor about the weird V-card conversation with Connie. I strongly and firmly believed that Ken had been some sort of player in Connie's game, and was just there to keep me away from guys and prevent me from having a boyfriend. For those who may be wondering, we never called the police on Connie or Ken because nothing illegal happened at face value. It's very hard to explain. I'll also mention that I tried to find Ken online many times after this all ended. I don't know why. I felt like I wanted to expose him or call him out, and was not able to find even a sliver of information on him. Not by the name Ken, nor by the name on the caller ID. It was as if he didn't even exist. Also, I'm awful at directions and didn't remember where his address or his house was exactly. I'm sorry if this story is convoluted or confusing. I'm trying to get my point across without giving out any names or too many details, which makes it a little challenging. I hope this can serve as a warning to young people to never trust anyone, to do your thorough checks on people, especially those you meet online, and to be very aware and weary of people's intentions. Also, from this incident onward, I can't stomach a lot of these spiritual organizations. I never liked the idea of them to begin with, but now I've truly experienced how they can attract both vulnerable people and also unsavory characters who are looking for someone vulnerable to prey on. No judgment for those who are into that sort of thing. It's just definitely not for me. Stay safe, everyone, and to Ken and Connie, if I see either of you again, I'll kick you in the face. Rot in hell. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 513. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Sorry for the clicking sounds as I'm recording there. I'm opening folders and renaming things. I've gotten fairly decent at multitasking over the years. At least in that regard. Like, talking and typing at the same time. It's a useless skill, but it's a skill I've developed nonetheless. It does kind of mean that during streams and things I can also search things up without breaking conversation. So there's that. Other useless skills, I can pick things up with my toes. Doesn't come in handy much, but it's helpful when I'm feeling especially lazy. Okay, and with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.